Mark Rogers TV talking college football, and it's not necessarily a glamorous matchup, Mizzou and Tennessee in Knoxville, but may hold more impact than just about any other game across the country when we talk about who could impact the college football playoff, when we talk about who could represent the East and possibly knock off the West in the SEC championship. We bring in Zac Ellis of SI.com to break it down for us. Zac, this is a situation that Mizzou's familiar with. They had to win 4 consecutive games last year to make it, surprisingly, to the SEC championship game last year. They find themselves holding the cards. Everybody's talking about Georgia being the best competition for the Western Division winner, but it's Mizzou who holds the cards right now.
Yeah, it's still crazy to think that this Missouri team that lost to Indiana at home pretty much controls its destiny when it comes to reaching the SEC title game, and that's the scenario they're looking at right now. They have to beat Tennessee, which this weekend doesn't look like a guarantee, and then Arkansas, an Arkansas team that now is looking pretty good coming off an LSU win. So, yeah, I mean, Missouri's in a spot right now where they could slide into Atlanta and still surprise some people, and it's kind of crazy. If I'm a Missouri fan, I have to be thinking, like, how is this team not getting any respect after last year and then this year? They talked about the preseason not having respect, and it still, for whatever reason, hasn't happened this year. I think the Indiana loss is a big part of it because if they had to drop that game, you're looking at a team that's lost, at home to a pretty good Georgia team at this point, and could be talking about, a playoff berth if they win the conference. So, yeah, I mean, right now it's kind of crazy to think they control the destiny, but that's the scenario that we're looking at right now.
And Tennessee's got some things to play for, and we'll talk about that in just a second. This defense has really carried this Mizzou team, considering they lost both defensive ends to the NFL last year. Their best corner Gaines to the NFL as well. They lead the SEC in sacks. Shane Ray rather, with 13 sacks, school record, leading the way. Marcus Golden really cut it loose against Texas A&M and played his best game of the season last week. So it's been the Mizzou defense. If you look at the scoring situation, just giving up 20 points per game, that has led Mizzou to this point.
Yeah, I think you're right. Going into the year, you saw losing players like Michael Sam on the defensive side of the ball, and suddenly it was still the narrative of having one of the best, at least in the SEC, one of the best defensive end duos in Shane Ray and Marcus Golden. That's kind of held true as far as the pass rush is concerned this year, and the defense, I think, has been it's been a very important part of what they've done thus far. The only, I guess, the big glaring omission on that is the Georgia game earlier this year. But at the same time, like I've alluded to before, the SEC East, just in general, these teams, you never know who's going to show up, any week. But yeah, I mean, we saw last week where the defense, had some trouble against Texas A&M, and that's to be expected because Texas A&M, obviously, their offense, we know what they're capable of, not what they'll do every week because we've seen them kind of fumble at times as well. But obviously, Texas A&M went on the road against Auburn. I think scored 41 in that game to win, and so playing Kyle Field is still a tough place, but they were able to hold on. And yeah, I still think that their pass rush is still one of the better ones in the SEC, and that will be an interesting matchup, I think, with this Tennessee team with the offensive line that Tennessee has.
Yeah, then on the offensive side of the ball, I think most of us were pretty comfortable with Maty Mauk coming into this season. Obviously, not necessarily the official starter, but taking over for James Franklin much of the bulk of the season, the meat of the season, and playing very well. 10-2 touchdown to pick ratio last year. Barely completed 50% of his passes. He likes to throw it downfield, and we're seeing much of the same this year at 53%, 19 touchdowns, 10 picks. And if you look game to game, again, it's the defense because 24 points against Vandy. Vandy's given up points in droves. Just 20-10 against Kentucky. Even the Florida score is deceptive. They scored 42 points in that game, but mostly special teams. Defensive returns in that game, just kind of a crazy game in the way they scored points and only had barely 100 yards of total offense in that game. So Mizzou fans have to feel a little bit better that they finally kicked it into gear at Kyle Field last week and scored some points and put up some impressive yardage totals.
Yeah, and you touched on Maty Mauk, and that was an interesting narrative to me going into the year was that you look at the quarterbacks that the SEC lost from last year, the A.J. McCarrons, the Johnny Manziels, there were some big names. And going into the year, it was kind of like, who's going to be the star in this league? And for whatever reason, kind of getting back to what I was talking about respect, Maty Mauk was kind of not, thought about, even though this guy led Missouri to, essentially led Missouri for most of the year to the SEC title game. But I think we saw this year a little bit why there wasn't that comfort with Maty Mauk as a legit start in the SEC, because he had some trouble, like you alluded to, with some turnovers and just keeping the offense on the field at times. But being able to click in a place like Kyle Field is a good place to do it, because you got to score points to keep up there. And I think that's going to be a similar situation right now going into this game against Tennessee, because now that they've got seem to have a little bit of juice on offense, being at home, they've played well there. They've got to score points to stay in this game. And I think also Hansbrough, their running back, was a big part of that game last weekend. Missouri's running back, that is. And the key for Maty Mauk, like a lot of the quarterbacks in the league right now, is limiting mistakes, because we saw that, I think it was the Georgia game, where like 2 or 3 of his first 5 passes were interceptions. It just didn't do very well early on in that game and kind of just deflated the whole offense. So if he can limit his mistakes, he can be very dangerous, not just with his arm, but with his legs. We hadn't seen that all year, but we saw a little bit last week of kind of being able to keep up in a foot race, and that might be the situation going into this weekend as well.
Yeah, kind of similar to the defense. They lost their playmakers coming back from last year with LaDainian Washington, Dorial Green-Beckham. Bud Sasser's a nice target. He's got 8 touchdowns. Russell Hansbrough, the main guy in the running game, as you allude to the Texas A&M game. He scored 9 touchdowns this year. So Gary Pinkel, in listening to his news conference this week, he talked about the offensive line performing much better than talking about just sustain those blocks another second. You can get our playmakers in space and be able to make some plays downfield if we're able to sustain blocks and get a better effort up front. So just your thoughts about the rest of the supporting cast in supporting Maty Mauk against Tennessee.
Yeah, and you touched on Sasser. I think he's kind of an underrated guy in their offense right now. But at the same time, I think that Hansbrough, at least last week, seemed to be one of the guys that really made an impact. And that's the key also. You see a lot of coaches talk about balance, and I think that's something that for any offense you're looking for. You have to be able to run the ball to throw it, and vice versa. And having that balance is when they look their best. When Maty Mauk is limiting mistakes, when Hansbrough's running between the tackles and able to get some yards after contact, that's when they can be their best. And that's when they're going to be the best against a Tennessee defensive line that can be pretty good at times too when it comes to the defensive side of the ball. So yeah, I think that supporting cast is somewhat underrated at times. But that's just because, like I alluded to earlier, if you're not keeping the offense on the field, you don't see these guys perform, and that's the key for them, I think, is being able to have that balance. And if the offensive line is playing well, like Pink was talking about, that's the key. That's the key for any offense, really, is having that protection. So that's going to be huge for them going forward in this game on Saturday.
Okay, Zach, let's talk some Tennessee football, because at just 5-5, they've got their goal in front of them to get to postseason play. Got the Vandy game to close it out, so you would think that they should be set up pretty well to get to a bowl game. Joshua Dobbs is the guy, obviously, that battled Justin Worley last season for the starting position. If you really look at the games, Worley played better against the better teams. He beat South Carolina. He took Georgia to overtime. But this season, Joshua Dobbs gets the opportunity against Bama, comes into a blowout game, put some points on the board against Bama. Then he's extremely impressive against South Carolina and put down 45 points in overtime. Ran for like 166 yards in that game. And the performance last week against an improved Kentucky team, putting up 50 points in that game, throwing for about 300 yards in both of those games against the Gamecocks and the Wildcats. So your thoughts about Joshua Dobbs and some of the problems he presents against Mizzou?
Yeah, you watch Joshua Dobbs play, and you sit there and you think, how have the coaches let this guy sit on the bench for all this season long? But a lot of that reason is, and you follow people who follow Tennessee, and they talk about the fact that Dobbs is one of those guys that, for whatever reason, sometimes doesn't perform in practice. Justin Worley was a guy this year when he was healthy that was a more consistent threat in practice, and that's the coach's best barometer for trying to pick a guy to start. And, maybe Josh Dobbs is one of those guys that's a gamer and goes out there and plays in big games. And last year we saw him kind of sneak into a few games as well and play a few, and wasn't as effective, especially when it came to throwing touchdown passes and just his accuracy. But he looks like he's really taken a step forward, and that's been huge for them. The way he played against Alabama, I think, was a real spark for that team, because you remember Alabama went out, to a 27-0 lead in that game, and they were able to cut it back to 10 and made it look a little bit more reasonable, because, the fans in Knoxville never enjoy getting blown out by Alabama. But yeah, he's a guy, and you look at the past quarterbacks the past few years of Tennessee, they haven't had a guy that's been a legit runner in a very long time. And I think that's something that really adds an extra element for them, because when that offensive line does collapse, and it does happen at times, he's able to still make some plays. And that's been big for them this year so far in the Alabama game. South Carolina, especially the last 4 minutes of that game when they came back from double digits, and then against Kentucky last week. So that's going to be huge for them, like I alluded to earlier. I mean, going against that defensive front against Missouri, what they can do, if he's able to kind of keep a play alive, and that was huge for them in their games going forward. So Josh Dobbs right now is looking like a real weapon for them, but we need to see him, in a complete game out there, because there are times when he can still make some mistakes as a young guy. But he's really grown a lot in the last year based on what he was doing last year, and that's all coaches can hope for right now.
Yeah, Butch Jones has brought in a couple consecutive top 20 recruiting classes there at Tennessee, but similar to the situation at Kentucky, although we would have to see that based on last week's results, that Tennessee's a bit further in the progress in developing back into an SEC power, that Tennessee's still a bit spotty in regards to SEC depth and talent. But where I was most impressed with the recruiting efforts in the secondary and at wide receiver, and we see where Josh Dobbs has a number of targets. Pig Howard's been on the roster for quite some time, but guys like Marquez North, obviously one of the best wide receivers in the SEC. Von Pearson's a junior. Josh Malone, one of their outstanding recruits over the past couple of years. So they spread the ball out around to a number of guys on the offensive side of the ball, and they're guys that have paid off in the recruiting wars that Butch Jones has brought in recently.
Yeah, I mean, you talk to Tennessee fans, I like to say that they're wide receiver you, and that just because look at the guys they've had in the past, and right now that's kind of how it's looking with some of these guys at the skill positions. I mean, you touched on Marquez North. He was huge in a couple games. I think he caught a huge pass in the South Carolina game last year that helped them upset South Carolina then. But yeah, in the Kentucky game especially, Von Pearson was a huge guy. He'd been injured for a little while, but he'd been able to come back and really make a huge impact. Josh Malone, I think, was a 5-star recruit. He was an in-state guy, too, which is huge because they're really trying to build a fence around that state, something that Derek Dooley, prior to him, did not do as well. And so, yeah, getting those skill guys obviously helps make your quarterback a little bit more lethal. And that helped Justin Worley in particular, a guy that couldn't run as much, be more effective with his arm in a lot of games this year. But the skill position is being huge for them. But the depth, like you talked about, that's a big part for them right now, is trying to find that depth, from an SEC perspective, because it's tough to find guys, who go out and play a solid number of snaps and find enough of them to fill out your roster. And that's something they didn't have a lot of depth with SEC caliber players. But they're building that back, and that's why I think you've talked about looking ahead. A lot of people talk about looking ahead next year based on what the East has looked like right now. Why not put Tennessee in one of those spots as maybe a favorite to contend in the East based on the young talent they have now and the development and the recruiting that Butch Jones is doing?
Yeah, and of course Jalen Hurd, another one of those guys that was a prized recruit and almost immediately had workload placed on him to help carry this offense. I think Tennessee, this is a stat that stayed with me from last season transitioning to this year, is that they were the only team in the country to return no starters on the offensive or defensive lines, and they come into this season, and again, it plays out the way we expected. They can handle the lower tier of the SEC pretty well against the upper tier. They've got much work to do. The secondary recruiting has been exceptional. We note what they lost up front defensively, and now they lose A.J. Johnson, who's involved in a rape case right now, first-team All-SEC linebacker, second on in the conference in tackles right now. So your thoughts about how they adjust to not just losing that type of talent, but leadership at the linebacker spot?
Yeah, I mean, you could argue he's the most important player, not just in their defense, but maybe even on the team when it comes to leadership and respect amongst the roster. I mean, he's a guy that could have left after last year and entered the NFL draft, but he decided to stick around. And I mean, you mentioned tackles. He is a tackle machine. I think if he doesn't have a record yet, he's close to getting program records. They're up on the all-time list for total tackles. I think he's at it maybe his third straight year with at least 100, and he's just a beast back there. But it's not just his production, like you talked about; it's his leadership, and that's going to be huge for them. I think losing that in a game that is against a legit team that people are still kind of overlooking in Missouri, and they've still got some talent at linebacker, and a guy like Kurt Magid, who was out last year with injury, but he's also another guy back there that's got about as much experience as AJ does. But replacing him is going to be very, very important, and trying to figure out a way to to replace not just his production, but his leadership, noticing plays, calling the plays. He's kind of the field general back there, So seeing what they do there is going to be big, but that's a big loss that a lot of fans might not realize because they look at the offensive side of the ball a lot more than the defensive. But that could really hurt if Missouri is able to, sustain some drives early in this game.
On paper, Mizzou's a pretty clear favorite, but at the same time, Tennessee coming off 50 points against Kentucky. They take Georgia to a 3-point game. They played fairly well. They beat South Carolina. Gamecocks not quite as good as we expected. Have you got a feel for this one?
Yeah, I actually think that Tennessee is going to hold on in this one. I just think that we've seen a little bit too much up and down from Missouri, and in some ways we've seen that for Tennessee as well. But I think that Tennessee right now is kind of hitting their stride with Josh Dobbs, with the offense. Like I talked about earlier, the opponents maybe haven't been as impressive as people thought, but I think that really showed what this offense is capable of, especially in that South Carolina game, being able to come back on the road, survive in overtime. And that really gave some juice for this team that, again, people thought would potentially miss a bowl game for I think the 4th straight year. But now it's looking like, like you talked about earlier, they play Missouri and then they play Vanderbilt. And right now I think there's a lot of momentum for Tennessee. Being at home, if this were in Missouri, I might feel differently. But being at home and the way they're playing right now, I think Josh Dobbs is able to make the plays when he needs to, even against that defensive front at Missouri with his legs. And so I think Tennessee wins this one. I would guess probably by about 10 points. That would be my guess.
Zac Ellis joining us from SI.com, talking Mizzou and Tennessee, with the Tigers having to win out to get to that SEC championship game. Hey, Zac, thanks so much for the information, the insight.
Thanks, Mark.